Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of lots of things, including good books and movies and TV shows. And I was recently on a plane and I happened to see American Fiction, which I had wanted to see. A movie, an Oscar-nominated movie about issues of race and representation within the publishing industry, among other things. And it's funny, it's smart, it's clever, I found it quite powerful. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And whenever I see something or encounter something that is a little beyond my own personal experience, I always want to talk about it with people who know more about that thing than I do. In this case, I thought I would talk to an old friend of mine, Gerald Coleman, who's a writer who we have been chatting for years. We met first at a convention, I don't know, a decade ago or thereabouts. And we get together periodically and we have a sort of regular little scheduled Zoom conversation. And I thought, well, you know what? Maybe I'll just record it. We'll just have our little chat that we do every few weeks. And this time I'll record it and share it with the world. So that's what this is. If this is a subject that doesn't interest you, move along, but hopefully you'll find it interesting and entertaining, thought-provoking. Enjoy.
How did you come to write this book?
What really struck me was that too few books were about my people. Where are our stories? Where's our representation?
Would you give us the pleasure of reading an excerpt?
Yo, Sharonda, girl, you be pregnant again? If I is, Ray Ray is gonna be a real father this time around. Thank
you. Monk, your books are good, but they're not popular. Editors, they want a black book.
They have a black book. I'm black, and it's my book.
You know what I mean.
Look at what they published. Look at what they expect us to write. I just want to rub their noses in it.
I'd be standing outside in the night.
Deadbeat dads, rappers, crack. You said you wanted black stuff. That's black, right?
I see what you're doing. We sold your book.
No.
We believe Mr. Lee has written a bestseller.
It's a joke.
The most lucrative joke you've ever told.
Now, is Stag a pseudonym?
Yeah.
Mr. Lee can't use his real name.
Is this based on your actual life?
Yeah, you think some bitch-ass college boy can come up with that shit?
No, I don't.
Can I ask what you were in for? Was it murder?
Yeah, you said that, not me.
They ran 300,000 copies.
Your books change people's lives.
They're offering $4 million for the movie rights.
Yes! The dumber I behave, the richer I get. This has gone too far.
Stag Hartley is still on the run from authorities.
You haven't done anything. It's not like they can arrest you.
Wish I could go back to not selling books.
Is it bad to cater to people's tastes?
People want to love you, Monk. You should let them love all of you.
There's already so much buzz because of the movie deal.
Michael B. Jordan is circling.
We want to put him on the cover in one of those scarves, I guess you would call them, tied around his head.
A do-rag?
Do-rag, that's it. Do-rag and a tank top with the muscles showing.
Somebody call the fire department.
We're thinking we can get it out in 100 Juneteenth.
Okay. So, I was just going to frame this as a chat because you and I haven't caught up for a little bit.
Yeah.
So we'll just sort of talk about things that we are interested in and working on at the moment. But I thought at some point we could maybe talk about American fiction as well. So I should introduce you, since you've never been on this channel before. I don't really have that many writers come on. And when I do, it's usually like a round table-y kind of thing to do like a particular issue. And I haven't done it for years. Anyway, so you are Gerald Coleman, all-round rock star. What?
Miscreant writer.
Miscreant writer, yeah, we can do that.
Miscreant writer at large.
Novelist, short story writer. What else? Theologian, poet. Whiskey and cigar connoisseur. troublemaker at conventions, which is how we got to know each other in the first place. Also, I should say, since it's only not been out that long, that you get credited as well, you don't actually get credited as anything. You just get credited. Acknowledgements, Gerald Coleman. And, because one of the other things that you do is that you work as what in the publishing industry is sometimes called a sensitivity reader, which is the worst title in the history of the world. I mean, because it sounds like it's like, oh, let's make sure nobody's feelings get hurt. And that's not what it is at all. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, I mean, I've done it. I've only just begun kind of really doing it. And I've only done it a few times because certain persons have asked me to do it. Aside from Trinity, one of the more recent ones is I wouldn't call that because I didn't read the script. What I did was talk to one of the script writers, and we had a conversation about some of the characterizations in the script and how they were written, and kind of what would be some things that they ought to look at, they might be concerned about. And it's and I haven't even talked to him yet to figure out whether or not I should be talking about it. So I won't name it, but it's a comic book film that the trailers dropped a few weeks ago, and some people are excited about it. The story comes from the people who were originally involved in actually writing the character. I'll say that. That's what I'll say and leave it alone. But they were concerned with how they had written one of the characters, who's a Black character. And we had a good conversation about it and talked about it. And ultimately, while they took kind of some of the things that I said and changed the script, I think the producers or the directors or whoever changed it back.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, but
Interesting.
so yeah, there's that, and then there's been a couple of others, and then your project, and so it's not something that I do a lot, but it's something that I'm open to doing. I don't do it for free, but I am. And I actually had to say something about that on social media, because for a while there were a lot of white authors who knew me who would reach out and ask, would I look at this? Would I read that? And I'm thinking, okay, I appreciate that you understand the necessity of having someone look at that and look at your work from a critical perspective culturally, to make sure you're not kind of making some kind of bush league errors that could be easily avoided. But at the same time, it's like, don't ask the people you know and people you're friends with to do work for free, especially when you know that they're writers like you and trying to make a living, doing what we do, which is hard enough. Yeah. So, for a long time, I'd been turning down a lot of stuff because people were really kind of asking me to do it for free. But yeah, it's so it's interesting, and it's something that I don't think I do it as like a 40-hour-a-week job, but I think if I found a project interesting or a writer that I was supportive of that was doing something interesting, it's something I'd be happy to do.
I mean, it's
interesting work. Yeah.
I mean, it's a consultancy gig, right? In certain respects, and should be treated like any other consultancy gig. For as far as I'm concerned, it's a research thing. That if I'm writing something and I start getting into territory that I don't know, or maybe that's plumbing or flying a fighter aircraft, I'm going to want to try to find out as much as I can. But with some of this other stuff, especially in terms about representation of culture, of race, or ethnicity, all those kind of things, I want to be able to go to people that I trust and say, show me when I'm getting it wrong, right? Show me how we can avoid some of the kind of things that publishing generally has been guilty of in the past. And it seems to me, and maybe this is as good a segue as any into the American fiction film,
Yeah.
is that publishing often professes to want to do the right thing and then doesn't for lots of reasons,
Well, and one of the major ones is that you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
I mean, it's not necessarily malicious. It's not malicious intent.
Yeah.
It's not even in a lot of ways, it's not even willful ignorance. It's just that you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to write in things that, for example, particularly, because we are readers, we've been readers, right? So as a reader of fantasy, let's say, and I've been reading fantasy since I was a kid. So, thousands of books, right? Well, hundreds and hundreds of books. And that can give you a lexicon to draw from, right? So as you're writing, I mean, particularly anytime if you're writing epic fantasy, there are just some touchstones, some places that readers of fantasy, particularly readers of epic fantasy, expect you to, stop off in those places, even if you're doing something interesting and different, which is what we should all be doing. But there is still kind of a certain expectation that there are going to be certain things that you will at least kind of pass by, even if you don't stay there for a while. But just because it's epic fantasy. And as a reader of epic fantasy, I'm expecting you to do certain things, right? Because that's what makes it epic fantasy and not sword and sorcery or dark fantasy or whatever other kind of, marketing terminology we're using. And so the danger is when you sit down to write, the danger is that you will write in something that has been long-standing in fantasy and not realize that contemporarily that's no longer acceptable parlance.
Give us an example. Can you think of an example where you think?
Oh yeah. Oh certainly. How women descriptors. When you're describing female characters, there are certain things that were just commonplace in fantasy for the last 30 years that is no longer really acceptable. Mm-hmm. Like you have to approach that differently. And if you aren't sensitive to that, and if you're not a woman writer, you might not be sensitive to the fact that, and I'm not talking about crass descriptors. I'm talking about stuff that just on the surface would seem really benign. And okay, we've always just used these kinds of descriptors to describe these kinds of characters, but those are no longer acceptable kind of ways to approach characterization in your writing, right?
What kind of descriptors are you thinking about?
Just describing a woman's curves and her body and, that kind of thing, which is
to physicalize her in ways you wouldn't with male characters,
right? And it's ubiquitous, right? In fantasy from the 70s and 80s and 90s, and so if you've grown up reading all of that and it's kind of hardwired into your idea of fantasy as you're writing, and you just kind of, you're just writing it out, that stuff can come out of you without any kind of critical kind of thinking about whether or not that is still appropriate in 2024. And it's not in a lot of ways. But if you're a male writer, you wouldn't know that, because that's just not something you would kind of necessarily know if you hadn't taken the time to like really kind of think through those things and maybe read some other stuff and maybe seek out some other kind of interesting opinions, and that folks can say, hey, look, maybe don't describe her this way. Maybe think about describing her in this way, right? And again, not that you're sitting down, because I do think that there are some people who sit down and try to write in ways that denigrate women, and they do that on purpose. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just the kind of the ubiquitous kind of, what you would see if you picked up a fantasy book from the 80s or 90s
with the chainmail bikini on the cover.
right. which
like,
is something like
this is what I wear into combat.
right. Which your mother's milk may have been kind of like early Conan books and all that kind of stuff. You might think because you haven't been exposed to other kind of people talking to you about that you might think that, okay, that's an acceptable way to, have my cover art. And you're gonna put that out, and you're gonna have a big surprise because you didn't take the time to kind of really understand how cover art has evolved in fantasy over the last 30 years. And it's really incumbent upon you to kind of put yourself in a position to kind of broaden and
Right.
thankfully most of the people that I know are part of having their writing in their personal kind of writing community and sphere, a diverse collective of people who can say, wait a minute, you thinking about what? Hold on, let's back up. Let's talk through that so that you can come to an understanding of why that might not be, an appropriate way to go. But there are a number of folks who, I said something about this the other day, who think the view from their front porch is all that they need to consider. And the view from their front porch is white, male, heterosexual, cisgender, right? Yeah. And they don't have a plethora of voices in their community that can help them understand that while that might have flown in the 80s or 90s, that's no longer an acceptable way of portraying characters, in your work. And you got to kind of work at getting beyond that. But if you're writing people from outside your cultural kind of expertise, you really need some other folks who can say to you, hey, think about this.
Right.
Look
and it's not like you're there to police it or to say this is wrong. You can't, apart from anything else, sensitivity readers don't have that kind of power over the product. What you can say is, here's what I'm seeing. Are you conscious of this? Do you realize that this is how this is going to play, or potentially will play, to certain audiences,
Right.
So, to my mind, it's about giving the writer more control of their medium, right?
Right.
And making,
Yeah, which is what I try to do when I write something up. I'm not saying, oh, you can't do this and you can't do that. I'm saying, hey, here's what I see. Maybe consider this or this. This is how this may be perceived and received.
Yeah.
That way, if you're okay with that, then you're okay with it, right?
Yeah.
No, really. I mean, because there may be some things where you're like, okay, this is not really going to be harmful to anyone, but you're missing an opportunity here to speak to the moment we're in a productive way. Right?
And that's what most authors actually want, right? Because if they're including characters of color or people of different genders or sexual orientations or whatever in their work, presumably they want those people to read their books. Most of the authors I know don't bring people other than themselves into the books in order to then go after them or denigrate them or something like that. That's not what they're doing. The problem is that a lot of authors want to be told you got it perfect.
Right.
And that's where you have to be the diplomat that we all know you to be.
You want to avoid those moments where an audience sees something and the response is, man, if you had just had someone in the room to tell you, maybe think about that again. The famous one is the Jenner Pepsi commercial, right? That was happening right in the middle of protests about police violence against Black folk, and Pepsi drops the commercial where Jenner walks from the protesters over to the cops who are lined up and offers them a Pepsi. As if, okay, this is how we're going to solve this this complex problem of police brutality and extrajudicial murder, right? And of course, they got in trouble for it, and it was unnecessary, because it was like, if you had just had some people in the room,
Right.
who could have told you how that was going to look, you could have saved yourself all of that backlash. And that's really what a lot of it is. It's just saying, hey, this may be a blind spot for you that you don't know is there. Again, it's not something malicious. It's just something that you're not aware of. Let me make you aware of it, so that you can then decide. So that you can decide how you, like you were saying, you can decide how you're going to proceed. It's not about me telling you how you have to proceed. It's about me saying, hey, here's something to look at. Think about, this is how it may be perceived by a community that you're not a part of. Think about that, and then decide kind of how you want to proceed.
Yeah.
With how you want to deal with that.
So, I mean, how does this affect? Because obviously, as we've already said, you're also a sci-fi and fantasy writer in your own right. And this, in a way, maybe a segue into the American fiction thing. Do you think of yourself as a fantasy writer or sci-fi writer? Do you think of yourself as a Black fantasy writer, sci-fi writer? Do you write Black books, right? Because this comes up in the movie.
Right.
So, I mean, or is race incidental to your work?
It's something that that kind of I and other Black writers like myself, we've talked about for the last decade. And for me, I think all of that is incidental to the writing. Like, when I sit down to write, I'm not writing a Black fantasy book. Although I am cognizantly writing fantasy with Black characters at the center of the story. But it's still a fantasy story, like any other fantasy story. The only difference is that the hero is Black.
Right.
So in that sense, no. There's that
right.
kind of duality there, that on the one hand, there is a clear intent behind a kind of representation that has not existed in fantasy, at least in the fantasy that I've read for the last 40 years. So there is a real intentionality in that respect. But in terms of the broader kind of story, no, it's a fantasy or a science fiction or a cyberpunk or a slipstream or a urban fantasy story, like any other. So there is a little bit of a duality there, but I don't sit down and say, oh, I'm writing this Black book. It is in the end Black because I'm the person writing it.
Yeah. And does that, maybe this is the same question. So you don't think of yourself as being a writer for Black readers?
And I think that's where the important kind of distinction is. Yes, right. I'm a Black author and I'm writing work that centers around Black characters, but I think my work is for any fantasy or science fiction reader to read, in the same way that I can read Michael Moorcock's Elric of Milne Bonet, and he's not writing for pasty albino elves, even though that's what his main character looks like. He's writing for science fiction and fantasy readers. Right?
But traditionally, of course, we have assumed that the normative position within fantasy and sci-fi, and frankly within most genres, is straight, white, usually male, Yeah.
Right.
And that's normal. Yeah.
Which I think has been untrue for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a comfortable fallback for people in publishing to not make decisions that they should be making by saying, oh, there isn't an audience for this, which is patently untrue. I know so many people of color who read science fiction and fantasy. I mean, famously, we've talked about this before, that
Yeah.
the reason that it took Black Panther so long to be made was, first of all, Perlmutter stood in the way of it, but there was this sense in the halls of Disney and in the halls of Marvel that there wasn't an audience for that movie because Black people don't go and see that. That's not an, which there are two problems there. First of all, right? First of all,
At least.
right? Again, you shouldn't be making Black Panther just for a Black audience. You should be making Black Panther for the same audience you made Avengers or Iron Man or whatever for. The only difference is that story is centered around Black characters. That's the only difference. And it's frustrating when it's okay to do that for white characters and to say, well, they're universal. No, they aren't. Right? But that's the prevailing opinion, that these characters are universal, and Shang-Chi or T'Challa or Ironheart or Luke Cage, that these aren't universal characters. And somehow they are for this other smaller finite audience. So we can't Hideki, right? So we can't put that much money behind them because no, these stories should be made for the same. They are made for the same audiences. It's just a question. It's just a question of people wrapping their head around the fact that Black Panther can also be a universal story, and it is a universal story. Hideki can be a universal story. It is, right? We are subjected to the most kind of niche white characters and stories that are put out for universal audiences, like the most niche kind of like hyphenated white character you can come up with, but it will still be released for a universal audience, no matter how niche that is. But when it comes to a character of color, suddenly, oh well, that's not for a universal audience. That's for this kind of little kind of subcategory. No, Shang-Chi should be seen by everybody. Black Panther should be seen by everyone. Deep Space Nine should be seen by, well, aside from the first couple of seasons, Deep Space Nine should be seen by everyone. But let me preface that before I make folks who watch this upset. Every Trek struggles for the first couple of seasons to find its footing. We just joke about that with Deep Space Nine. It's the same thing. But yeah, so that's a consternation for me and for a lot of other people who are writing these characters, that there's this presumption that the story we're writing isn't a universal story just because it's centered around a character who is not white and male.
And this comes up in American fiction. Now, I have not read the book, and I only saw the movie comparatively recently, which is why we haven't really talked about it before. Yeah. But that's a concern within the book, right? The question of whether the author is producing Black literature and what defines Black literature and what he has to sort of wrestle with in the course of the story. I was like,
it's such a great movie. It there were so many opportunities. Kind of like I was so glad it didn't turn out to be another what's that movie called, The Society of Magical Negroes?
Oh,
like,
yeah.
I was like, I mean, that had the opportunity, because I thought it was going to be like American fiction, that it was going to be hey, we're going to critically take on this trope.
Right.
And the first trailer made it seem like that's what was going on. But when the full trailer dropped, let me tell you, myself and everybody I knew was like, are you serious right now? Are you serious? Like, you just basically, dove headfirst into the trope, like unironically, right? Instead of doing this thing that we thought you were going to do was this kind of smart, kind of tongue-in-cheek, kind of takedown of the trope. They actually just basically ran with the trope.
Right.
which was sad to see. But yeah, I was so, because like I spent the first probably 20, 30 minutes of the movie like waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like, okay, at what point is this going to go left and become yet another, you know, one of these kind of film? And it never did, all the way to the end. I was so surprised, but so glad that that it became what it is, which is a really interesting, kind of sharp, kind of witty, kind of take on the state of publishing. Like, yeah, that's exactly what goes on, and Wright's portrayal of a Black author is like he nailed it. Like that's precisely where we are. You know, I think maybe the only thing that I didn't find as convincing was Issa Rae's character's take when he finally confronts her, because they wanted to kind of make it so that she was in some way justified in writing what she was writing, and to kind of push him back on his heels about his criticism of it. And that I didn't buy as much. But, you know, the rest of it was
because really, it wasn't her story, right? I mean, that was sort of what was odd about it, that she defended it in terms of the research that she had done, but that didn't change the fact that it was all sort of stereotypical, and it clearly wasn't her vocal register or anything like that.
That and the thing that I constantly say is context is king. When you're talking about race, context is king. You know, because what a lot of people try to do is make statements that would be true, all things being equal, right? But all things aren't equal. And that's the problem. The problem is you have to add context, the contemporary context. And once you add the contemporary context, then you have to grapple with what that means in that context. I mean, you can say anything about race that ought to be true in a world where these other kind of systemic systems don't exist. Yeah, that would work. That would be true. That would be fair. But that's not the world in which we live. But for example, affirmative action enrollment in colleges. Oh, well, everyone should be judged on blah, blah, blah. And it should be equal. And yes, it should be. All things being equal. If we lived in a world where systemic racism didn't exist and 200 years of, you know, systems being put in place to disenfranchise Black people, yes, that should be the way the world is. But that's not the way the world is, right? That's not the context in which admissions to colleges exist. They exist in a system, in a culture where there is a system that has systematically disadvantaged people of color, particularly Black folks, and you have to address that, right? And so, you know, I think that's probably part of where my struggle was with that little kind of bit of the plot, because, yeah, like you said, that, okay, yeah, well, her argument would be valid in a world where all things were equal.
So, yeah,
but it's not. She's putting that book out in a world that has a particular context. And in that context, her argument to me didn't kind of pass muster.
And the related issue, of course, is one of the things that we get within the film is this pressure to treat racial groups as monoliths. So there is one kind of Black story.
Right.
Well, maybe two, right? Because it's like either super positive or super negative. It's gritty, it's real, right? The terms that the what is that committee, the award committee?
Right.
And, you know, and they're talking about celebrating Black voices, and the people in the room who are saying this is a bad idea are the Black writers.
Right.
And they're being overruled in pursuit of an idea of what constitutes blackness,
Right.
which is
Right.
clearly, which doesn't fit the people in the room with them.
Right. It's always kind of interesting and disheartening to me when, for example, you get to like Black History Month and these streaming platforms, put that line of TV shows or films on their thing. We're celebrating Black History Month, and here's all of our Black content. And when you scroll through that list, it's monolithic.
Mm.
Well, it's dualistic. They're one of two stories. There is trauma porn stories, gangsters, drug dealers, slavery stuff,
right?
Or
magical Negroes.
This is the thing. This is the thing. When you said the positive stuff, the problem with the positive stuff is that generally there's a white savior in there somewhere. That even that story isn't really about the Black character overcoming traumatic circumstance. It's usually about, hey, here, look, there was this horrible stuff going on, but there were good white people involved. Look at Kevin Costner, at NASA, a character who didn't even exist, who they made up because Kevin Costner wanted a positive white character in the movie. Hidden Figures is what we're talking about, for those who may not know. He wanted a white character, a white character who was good in the movie. So they created that character as a composite character out of several characters and then added the stuff that they wanted to add. And my problem with that is that takes away from the real heroism and the real kind of guts and the real kind of, heroic nature of the Black characters, in that, because they didn't have that character there in real life.
Yep.
Who went down the hall and tore down the bathroom sign and said, you should be able to use the bathroom here, right? That undermines what those characters actually went through. They didn't have that. And so my problem is don't show that. Show the real thing so that those people get their just desserts of showing what they actually really had to stand up against. Because the truth of that story is she went into the white bathroom because she didn't give a damn.
Mm-hmm.
She went in there because she was going to go in there, and there wasn't anybody at NASA who was going to tell her she couldn't use that bathroom. Now that gets thrown away because Kevin Costner wanted a good white person character, and to have his moment to say, "Hey, white people are good too," right? So yeah, it's for example, you go on to Starz, the Starz Network's app, 1,000,001, and we can talk about Black folks cashing in on that because 50 Cent cashed in on this idea of trauma porn, with Starz, because he's an executive producer on all those shows that are about gangsters, drug dealers, Power and Power Part 2, and the list goes on, Hustle, and all this kind of street terminology, and as if, yes, those people exist and that's a part of the real world experience of Black folk, but that's not all of what we are. That's not even a majority of what we are. But if you look at popular media, you would think we were either slaves or gangsters or hustlers, right? We don't get the Mary Tyler Moore show with a Black woman. We don't get Gilligan's Island with a Black Gilligan. We don't get
I would pay money to see that right there.
Right? We don't get Barney Miller, or we don't get Silo, or we don't get these really interesting, complex stories across genres with Black characters as the lead characters, because there's this presumption, which American fiction tackles, is this presumption that there's only one kind of story out there to be told, and that has an audience.
Mm-mm.
I think they did a phenomenal job.
What do you think? I was trying to think as you were saying. I was trying to think of shows centering on Black characters that don't do those tropes. Obviously, I'm a Brit, and so there are some of those kind of shows in the UK, but they run a different risk, right? Which is that they are effectively colorblind. The blackness of a character sort of
Disappears. Yeah.
disappears, right?
Yeah.
But, I mean, I was thinking about something like Luther.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love Luther. It's a great show.
Yeah.
Listen, I don't want the prevailing understanding to be that somehow every character has to be this lawful, good, shining knight, right?
Mm.
Of course, there should be some of those because we've never gotten those. We should definitely have some of those characters. We should have a whole bunch of positive representational characters out there. We should have a new girl, that show with Zoe Deschanel. There should be a new girl-ish type show with a Black girl who's the center of that show.
What was that Queen Latifah show that the woman from American Fiction was in? She's also in Bosch. She's Lance Reddick's wife in Bosch. What's her name? I've forgotten. But she played in American Fiction. She was the sort of the love interest for the main character.
Right.
Do you remember that show? It was like the 90s.
Living Single.
Living Single. Yeah.
Which there is this whole kind of, it's crazy. There's this whole kind of conversation about how Friends stole that basically that idea from Living Single and did it, and then didn't put any Black characters in it.
Right.
Like you can see episodes where they basically completely lifted the plot from a Living Single episode and just dropped it into Friends.
Yeah.
Like that's a real thing. I'm a fan of The Equalizer with Queen Latifah. That's a rare example. All Rise, which is a courtroom drama where the Black female character is a judge. So there are a couple out there, but the problem is that the pool is just too small, right? It should be broader. I mean, I like the fact that what's the sci-fi show on Apple with the two Black women who are kind of sort of Foundation, where Foundation is. Yeah, the two female characters are kind of sort of they're not really the main characters, but they're kind of sort of the characters. They get a lot of screen time. That's a step in the right direction. But my point is that when you look at white shows, there's just this broad catalog of character types, all kinds of every kind of permutation that you can think of. That there's a show out there with a white character who is doing that. Yeah. And we need to see much more of that for not just Black characters, but people of color in general, but Black characters particularly, because it's what I'm talking about. Yeah. But we get kind of like they were talking about it, which is basically the premise of American Fiction, is that we get siloed into, oh no, if you're not doing this specific thing, which is basically trauma porn, which is not for Black audiences. It's for white audiences, right? A lot of these kind of like slave narrative shows and gangster shows are not actually really for white audiences. They're entertainment for white audiences. Even though some Black audiences members watch this stuff, sure, it's really not aimed at us. It's, hey, see, here's how they are.
Right. And that's the thing, right? Because on the one hand, the issue is about creating complex characters of color who will be appreciated by readers and audiences of color. But it's also about breaking down those stereotypes for a lot of white folks who don't have a lot of people of color in their lives. And the TV and the film and the books and stuff that they read is constantly generating these stereotypical ideas. And they think that's how the world is.
Right, right, right. Which is Monk's problem in the film, because the book Pathology, Pathology, right? Which becomes, no, I want the title to be Fuck. Just messing with them to see how far they'll go, and they finally come around. Yeah, oh, it's a brilliant idea. That somehow or other that's kind of all that there is available.
Yeah.
What was the HBO show that was set in the 50s, but it was the horror show that with the black cast, but very interesting in that, you know, it didn't have stereotypical characters. It was a science fiction fantasy show, and it showed that the real monsters were the white characters in the show, right? I mean, there are literal monsters in the show, but when you're watching it as a black person, the most angst-ridden moments were when they're driving, they're trying to get out of a sundown town as the sun is going down, and a white cop is behind them. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the horror in the show.
Right.
Right? Yeah. Even though there are literal monsters in the show that you think are the parts of the show that are the horrific elements, but they did it well enough to show that, no, the horrific element for the black characters were actually like these white characters in these roles of authority who were abusing that authority and in turn abusing the black characters, and that these characters could actually lose their lives on a dirt road outside of sundown town because the cop decided to pull them over.
It's reminiscent of Get Out and those kind of stories as well.
No, I think the interesting thing about Get Out is that Jordan Peele, it could have been that if the main character had been kind of a stereotypical black character,
right? But
he wasn't, right? Mm-hmm. He was a human being who happens to be black, who has this thing happen to him because he's black, right? Yeah. Which is a different thing. There was a show that on Netflix that I was initially repulsed by because I thought that they cloned Tyrone. Have you seen that?
No.
It's got John Boyega, you know, from Star Wars, Jamie Foxx, some other black characters, but Boyega plays a drug dealer, Fox plays a pimp, and I can't remember the sister's name. She plays a prostitute. And when at first glance I was like, here we go again. But when you watch it, you see why they did that, because the show is basically about, it's a sci-fi fantasy story, or speculative fiction. Let's put it that way. And it's basically, and the premise of the show is basically that you find out, spoilers for anyone who hadn't seen it yet, who wants to tune out right now. It's on Netflix. They clone Tyrone. You find out that the premise of the show is that the white power structure has created these black people who are clones,
right?
Who are drug dealers, pimps, prostitutes, and they are populating black communities with these people in order to hold down black people, right? So it's that they are putting drug dealers into these communities, and Tyrone happens to be a clone who is all over he's been cloned and is in all of these black communities all over the country, and his job is to, you know, denigrate the black community by being in it and being a negative influence on it. And so when they get down under the underground in the city that they're in, they see all of these tubes with all of these clones in them, and they find out that this is what the white power structure in the government is doing. And the message is, look at what you're doing to your community by being a drug dealer, by being a pimp, by being these negative influences inside your community. That's the message. And so while on the surface it plays into the same kind of, oh, this is just a story about thugs and drug dealers and gangsters, they use that and kind of flip the trope on its head to tell this other story, right? But yeah, again, for example, when you go to the Stars app and you look at their because they're these streaming apps say, here's a list of our original programming, and you can scroll through that, and all it is drug dealers, gangsters, all of the shows. And I'm like, wow, like you like playing in our face, like like you putting that out like this is like, hey, nah, wink, wink, right? Like this is okay. No, it's not okay. There's not one show in that list that's like a New Girls with a black female character. You know, something different and interesting and unique, a lighthearted comedy or a rom-com or a sci-fi show, any of these other kind of million other things that could be produced, but instead you get the same stuff. What was the title of Issa Rae's character's books? We Be From the Ghetto or something like that in American fiction. It's like that's all they have to offer, and it's right there in our face.
So what do you want instead? I mean, because I'm conscious that it's almost 7 o'clock, which means I'm sure that I will have to release you to go and watch the Falcons lose.
But like I've been saying, give me something interesting. The same kind of latitude you give white creators to create all of these different kinds of stories. Give to black creatives to do the same thing, right? I would love to see a show like New Girl that has Zoe in it, which is a show I enjoyed. But I'd love to see a show like that with a black female character as the protagonist. I'd love to see. I mean, that's why I watch Will Trent. I'm not big on cop shows, but at least he's an FBI agent instead of a street cop, and they open it by showing that cops are mad at him because he's put dirty cops behind bars, right? So it sets up a different kind of dynamic. His boss is a black woman. His partner is a black woman. He's a person of color. Okay, like give me that, right? Give me those kinds of shows. I mean, give me some more stuff like Luther. You know, you were talking about British shows. I've talked to you before about the show called Hustle that has Adrian. What's Adrian's last name?
Lester.
Adrian Lester as the mastermind of all things. Like the crew is a crew of grifters. One of the ways that they get around that being a negative is that they only go after corrupt people. Right. They're not like scamming grandmas out of their retirement money. They're scamming like the big bad white dudes who are like the corporate monsters who are doing terrible things. That's who they go after, which is one of the reasons that kind of helps kind of sell the fact that they're grifters. But it's not just that he's one of the crew. It's that the thing that I love about it is that he's the mastermind. He's the smartest person in the room. And even though the other people on the crew are talented in what they do, he's the person who comes up with the plan. He's the person who gets them out of jams that they're in. We don't get portrayed in that way often at all, right? Even when we're in the cast, the smartest guy in the room is usually a white dude. I'm excited to see Aldous Hodge on Amazon playing Alex Cross.
Okay, right.
Alex Cross, the detective Alex Cross. Aldous Hodge, they're doing a show where he plays Alex Cross.
Who wrote those books?
James Patterson.
That's what I thought.
Patterson, yeah. And they've already renewed it for season 2, and season 1 hadn't released yet. So they must be really happy with what they're seeing. And Reacher had the same thing happen. Like as soon as they kind of looked at it, they decided to renew it immediately. So I'm hoping it gets the same kind of reception that Reacher got. Because I think Aldous Hodge. I first saw him in Leverage, which is an American version of Hustle. And Aldous Hodge played the computer expert, but of course the mastermind was played by Timothy Hutton, white dude. Right? Which is what usually happens, right? The smartest guy in the room is usually portrayed as a white character. But Aldous Hodge was really good in that. I think that was part of what kind of launched him. And so I'm interested to see that. But I want to see a lot of that. I want to see much more of that. There's so many, different kinds of, I want to see a Black Sherlock Holmes character. I want to see, like I said, when you talk about white characters, every single permutation of a white character has been created and tried in novels, films, and TV. Every permutation you can think of, from the shining white, knight, lawful good character, to the anti-hero, the guy who's an asshole, but he gets tolerated because he's so smart, right? Which is what happens with a lot of the kind of plays on the Sherlock Holmes character. House, a very famous version of that, where it's like, we tolerate this bad behavior because he's just so brilliant, right? So from the lawful good character all the way down to Hannibal Lecter, right? You see all of these permutations. So I want to see all of that kind of stuff with Black characters, because there's an audience for it. It's because they should be treated as universal characters in the same way that white characters are treated as universal characters.
Which seems like a perfect place to stop. Because
before we go, congratulations on your nomination for the Dragon Award.
Oh, thank you.
For Hideki. Yeah.
I'm sure
that's well deserved.
Win or lose, we will find time at Dragon to have a glass of something.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
And certainly I'm happy to see Trinity doing well. I think you having read your stuff, I think you're an exceptional writer. Burning Shakespeare was such a pleasant read. I was laughing, because I kept texting you, laughing about parts. It's a skill that I would like to cultivate much more in my writing. I think there's certainly parts of my writing where kind of the humor of it comes through. But I think you're really masterful at doing that in a subtle way. Not that this is a comedic book, but that there's comedy in with the drama and the tragedy and all the rest of it, which is the kind of comedy that I'm interested in further cultivating in my own work. So I have no doubt that Hideki is deserving of the honor, and I hope it wins.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate it. I mean, I think the odds against it are pretty long. It's probably the smallest of the books in that category, but we live in hope.
There's that British. You're quintessentially British, right? Like, well, I love it though. I love it. Tell the wife and the son, hey.
Well, they're in Chicago at the moment, but I will pass it along.
Very cool. Thank you for inviting me to talk about American fiction. That was fun. I hope we covered something interesting.
Yeah, I think so. So yes, thank you. I really enjoyed this, and hopefully we will get to do something like it again sometime soon. And that's it. As ever, please like, comment, subscribe. It is currently August, and as Gerald suggested, Hideki Smith is currently up for the Dragon Award, which is a popular vote thing. Anybody can vote for it. I'll include a link so that you can register your email address and cast a vote. There's a lot of cool stuff listed in various categories. I will be voting, of course, for Godzilla -1 in the best fantasy sci-fi movie category, but Hideki Smith is up for young adult novel. So please check that out, and check out my merchandise. Please check out my Patreon page. Thank you as ever to my patrons who make this channel possible. Thanks, and I'll talk to you soon.